Let's hear it.
Oscar Wilde once said imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but I think there's more insight to the full quote.
The first reason is that the Bible contradicts itself. Let's go through these.
All right, let's see it.
Starting from the top. In Mark 16, it says they left the tomb and they said nothing to anyone. In Matthew 28, it says they left the tomb and ran to bring his disciples word. Broader context and narrative of the book of Mark shows why this is not a contradiction. Throughout the book of Mark, you'll find a common thread of Jesus telling witnesses to stay silent. But the silence never sticks. For example, in Mark 1, it is requested that they say nothing but go and show themselves to the priest. But then the silence does not stick. Or plausibly, it's in the same way as Mark 16. It does not say they never said anything. Putting it together, they said nothing until they got to the disciples. Not a contradiction.
No, it is not remotely plausible to read details into this story that are not in the text in light of the messianic secret. The messianic secret was this theme running throughout Mark's gospel where Jesus repeatedly instructs his disciples not to tell anyone who he is, and then his disciples repeatedly ignore his instructions. There are no instructions in this scene. There is no indication whatsoever that they are ignoring Jesus' instructions. This is the end of the original version of the Gospel of Mark. Verses 9 through the end of chapter 16 were added much later. And this ending is supposed to be dramatic. It says that they ran off and they didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid. This is entirely unrelated to the messianic secret, and the notion that we can impose the messianic secret to assume details and scenarios that are not stated in the text is absolutely laughable apologetics.
On to John 1, it says no one has seen God, and in Genesis 32 it says Jacob has seen God face to face. First of all, face to face does not have to be understood literally.
Yes, it does, and particularly in Exodus 33, where it further explains that this means Moses spoke to God as a man speaks with his companion, friend, or neighbor. It quite explicitly is to be understood literally.
For example, in Numbers 12 it says, I the Lord reveal myself to them in visions, I speak to them in dreams. Yet he says, with him I speak face to face.
I am genuinely at a loss to explain why this creator thinks that this supports the notion that this is not to be understood literally. All I can guess is that there's again a presumption of univocality because it says only Moses gets to speak face to face, therefore Jacob could not have been speaking face to face. But again, that presupposes univocality. It presupposes that the author of this passage in Numbers agrees in all details with the author of that passage in Genesis, who agrees in all details with the authors of the passages in Exodus. And that is presupposing univocality. And when you are debating whether or not the texts agree to presuppose univocality is wildly, flagrantly begging the question.
Again, see this type of figure of speech in Exodus 33.
Notice this creator does not share the text of Exodus 33 because that's where it says Moses spoke with God face to face as a man speaks with his companion, friend, or neighbor. It explains, yes, this is physical, literal, face-to-face speech.
The same way I can see someone eye to eye without literally looking them in the eyes.
So this is a modern English idiom that has absolutely nothing to do with the Hebrew idiom panim el panim, which is always used to refer to physical face-to-face interaction. Additionally, you don't see someone eye to eye. You see an issue eye to eye, or you see eye to eye. So the idiom is not even being accurately represented. It's being massaged so that it sounds closer to the Hebrew idiom, which is entirely unrelated.
Secondly, the New Testament picture of Jesus informs us.
So the New Testament has absolutely no relevance whatsoever to how the authors of Genesis or Numbers or Exodus intended for their texts to be understood, unless you're already presupposing univocality, which, again, in a debate about whether or not the texts conflict, would be flagrantly begging the question. Now, for what changed between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament that led the New Testament authors to understand God as invisible, you can see my video number McClellan 1784, where I go into great detail.
Moving on to Matthew 19, it says, with God all things are possible. And in Judges 1, it says the Lord could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley. It ignores the context of Judges 1 and 2.
It's not ignoring it, it's just not accepting the presupposition of univocality. The overwhelming academic consensus is that Judges 1 comes from different authors and editors and a different time period from Judges 2, which is overwhelmingly Deuteronomistic. And so it is a different telling of the story with different details. So to bring them together and say we must interpret Judges 1:19 by subordinating it to Judges 2:20 is first to presuppose univocality and then to negotiate priority for Judges 2 because that best serves your rhetorical goals. So this is, again, flagrantly begging the question. And let's just review the academic consensus. This is from the SBL Study Bible. The note for chapter 2, verses 6 through 10 says, "A generation gap triggers the state of affairs described in Judges. These verses seem to conclude the assembly of Joshua 24, verses 1 through 27, and repeat Joshua 24, verses 28 through 31, thus passing over Judges 1:1 through 2:5, and connecting directly to the end of Joshua. This suggests that chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 5 was added as a later supplement." Then we have the New Oxford Annotated Bible's note on the same passage. Resumption of the narrative from Joshua 24, verses 28 to 31. At one point, this may have joined Judges to Joshua, suggesting that chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 5 are a later edition. Then in the second edition of the Jewish Study Bible, we've got this discussion about this same introduction to chapter 2. This description is rich in repetitions and in Deuteronomistic expressions, suggesting that it is a late framework created to incorporate stories about individual judges, because chapter 1 doesn't refer to any judges. Chapter 2 is the one that's like, oh yeah, there were these judges. Then we have Susan Neidich's 2008 commentary on Judges from the Old Testament Library. The language, content, and themes of Judges 2, moreover, parallel those of Deuteronomistic writings, emphasizing the idolatry of the natives of the land, the need to separate from these peoples, the tendency to break covenant by consorting with foreigners, and the punishment as defeat that follows. The texture of the passage would seem to indicate a late Deuteronomistic voice. The register is thus quite different from that of chapter 1, which more often than not assumes an epic style, although its date, as preserved, may well be as late or later than that of chapter 2. And we could go back to Sagan's commentary on Judges from the same series from 20-some-odd years earlier. This text has abundant terms and expressions typical of the Deuteronomistic history. As we have seen, the opening does not refer back to Judges 1:1 through 2:5, but to the end of the book of Joshua. And for the most recent critical commentary on how Judges chapter 2 came together, here are a couple of paragraphs from Elizabeth Blocksmith and Mark Smith's recent Hermeneia commentary on the book of Judges.
In Judges 2, it is explained that the Lord was very angry with Israel and therefore said he will no longer drive them out. That section of Judges parallels the beginning. Scholars note that the first section narrates from the point of view of the Israelites, which is what you quoted. The second section narrates from the point of view of God, which is what I quoted. Context shows that God was not defeated. He was just angry at their idolatry. No contradiction.
So this entire argument relies on presupposing the univocality of Judges 1 and Judges 2, which is rejected by the long-standing and overwhelming academic consensus. And here this creator can only support this presupposition with appeal to a single book from 1989 that was not accepted by the overwhelming majority of scholars back when it was published and has only become less accepted since then.
Good reason to believe in the Bible because we have good reason to believe that Christ rose from the dead. Investigate that first.
Investigate the fallacy of begging the question, and then investigate your own biases and learn to think more critically.